I'm Rachel Hall. I'm the editor of the Guardian's Higher Education Network, and I'm here to contribute to the Talk teaching series.
So, Rachel, can you tell us a bit more about your job?
So I'm the editor of the Guardian's Higher Education Network, and it's a community platform for people who work in higher education, so that's academics and also professional services staff, and it's a place for them to share news and views and analysis and features.
And does it help to inform your work, visiting other universities like this?
Definitely. I mean, it's always great to chat to people who work in universities and find out what they're actually thinking about. I mean, I get sort of a bit of a feel for it from Twitter and the comments that people post on the pieces that we publish, but it's always nice to speak to people face to face as well.
So is this your first visit to Bath?
It is my first visit to Bath University, although I've been to the city before because I studied just down the road in Bristol, so I've had quite a few visits. I'm very impressed by the Arts Centre. It's very modern and looks like it has really great facilities, so if the rest of the university is the same, I'll be very impressed.
What was it that led to your interest in how future generations might view universities and approach university life?
The idea for the talk came from an interview I did with the former education policy advisor to Barack Obama, and she's a woman called Karen Gross, and she's written a book called Breakaway Learners, which is about how universities need to start preparing now for children who are still in nappies or not even born yet, so they can give them the best education that suits their learning styles and suits the kind of employability skills they'll need.
So you talk about breakaway learners. Are there some characteristics we could use to describe those learners or identify them in some way?
The sort of key factors that she points out are, firstly, the kind of greater penetration of technology. So children from all socioeconomic backgrounds will have access to computers and the internet, whether that's at school or at home. She also points out that learners will be more diverse as widening access initiatives are more and more successful. There'll be more students who are first in their family to go to university, and also the greater cultural and ethnic diversity, because that's the way in which the population in the US, and I think it's comparable in the UK, is changing.
Is this across the board, do you think, or is it just in particular areas? What are the key ways that you think universities can do to start to address this?
So, I mean, one of her key points is universities building closer links with schools and spending more time in schools in order to find out how children today are learning. So, for instance, that might look at observing how coding is being taught and then take that back and use that to inform their curriculum, and that might feed into technological advancements. And making sure that universities are sort of equipped for the greater level of technology that students will be expecting in the curriculum. But it might also be about greater support, helping kind of students who are first in their family to go to university or who come from schools that weren't as good at equipping students for the transition to university. It might be about having more pastoral support in place.
What sort of interest are you anticipating for this afternoon's talk? Do you think people are going to be ready for these messages, or do you think they're going to arrive perhaps slightly sceptical?
I mean, one of the questions when I interviewed Karen Gross about this subject was if it's really reasonable to plan 20 years ahead, and her point was there aren't sort of cast iron walls in between the two generations. So any kind of changes that you make to accommodate what she calls Generation Alpha, so that's kids born between 2010 and 2025, will also benefit the current generation of students. So, you know, improving technology, particularly kind of in the curriculum, and looking for innovations in curriculum delivery, and also kind of better student support that will help students today as well.
What criteria can we use to identify who's in Generation Alpha, or what that category represents?
So, I mean, obviously, the generations, they're not concepts that are set in stone, and the lines are often blurred. I mean, for millennials, for instance, people will say they're people born in the early 80s to the year 2000, and other people will say, you know, kind of mid 80s to early 90s. You know, it really depends. But Generation Alpha, as they're starting to be called, would be born in 2010 to 2025, and they'll be the children typically of millennial parents, and on average, they'll be slightly wealthier. Their parents will be a little bit older and more likely to outsource certain aspects of parenting, like childcare, which obviously has an impact on their development, as I mentioned earlier as well. Then they'll have more access to technology, and from an earlier age, you know, these are the kids who'll be learning coding at school.
Are we anticipating this generation to have different psychological approaches, do you think? Are they going to be more fragile, more resilient, more rough and ready? Are they going to have different approaches to learning?
I mean, I'm not sure. It's probably, I think, too early to sort of start saying that sort of thing about kind of toddlers. You know, we can only look at the sort of broad brushstrokes. Obviously, there's a lot of media coverage about kind of student snowflakes of the current generation of students who would be the Generation Z. You know, if we're using those terms, but But I think sort of things like their, as I said before, their parents' different approaches to childcare could impact the kind of students they'll be. But that sort of thing that I don't think we really can preempt. But things like knowing that they will be more diverse and that they will have had more exposure to technology are definitely things that universities can start gearing up to prepare themselves for.
So when do we expect Generation Alpha to actually be hitting the university streets? When can we really expect to see them? Are there things that we could be doing now to prepare for them realistically? Can we be thinking about infrastructure, IT, buildings? What can we be doing now to plan for their arrival?
Well, if they start being born in 2010, then that would be 2028 by the time they're starting university. So that's a long way away. But as I mentioned before, the kind of changes that you can start making now will also benefit current students. So if you're looking to introduce more technology into the curriculum, then that's not something that's only going to be beneficial in 20 years' time. I mean, there's other things that you can't predict. You can't predict exactly what the labour market will be like, but the things that you can sort of start preempting by doing things like looking into schools to seeing how learning styles are evolving, sort of seeing that students are becoming increasingly interested in having more say and more input into how the curriculum is developed through the sort of idea of being co-creators, and also looking at the fact that a lot of widening access students get lower grades or are more likely to drop out. You can start adapting to make that transition easier. Anything that you can start doing now, or anything that you think that you can preempt, particularly since it will already benefit students who are already at university, it seems that's a sensible thing to do.
Thanks very much, Rachel. We've got more events, talks and interviews coming up as part of our Talk Teaching series here at the University of Bath. Follow the Centre for Learning and Teaching on Twitter and make sure you book into the next event.